Here's our panel as well, Stephen Lawson and Fred Hicks joining us. Stephen Lawson, Republican strategist, Fred Hicks, Democratic strategist. And guys, what I was going to say is I believe, at least on the Republican Party, tonight will be a test to see the weight of Donald Trump as well as the weight of Governor Brian Kemp. Stephen, as a Republican, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned these endorsements, these major endorsements that came in over the weekend, Faith. And I think, if it was a poker game, all of the chips from Donald Trump and Brian Kemp are been pushed to the middle, and this is the ultimate test of their political fortitude, their political will, and how much pull they have in the state. So lots at stake.
Fred?
Well, I agree with what Stephen said. And as a Democrat, we're eagerly anticipating and waiting to see who we're gonna who will face in November. The road to November starts tonight, and like Stephen said, we're going to look at the maps and study the data as well. We'll see.
That's right. And before we get to our answers, I do have to ask you all, were you surprised by these endorsements? Coming Sunday, I believe.
That looks like a surprise face. That looks like
So surprised at the timing. I'd heard maybe a week or two ago that endorsements were coming and that it would happen at the beginning of last week. So by the time we got to the end of early voting, and it hadn't happened, I just assumed that it wasn't going to happen. So I was surprised by the timing of it. But that tells me that the polls, at least the internal Republican polling, says that this race is really close and that there's a lot at stake here.
And that, just to be clear for those, if we did not mention it, Donald Trump endorsing Mike Collins as well as Governor Brian Kemp, putting an endorsement. We did not think he was going to weigh in this gubernatorial primary, putting his backing behind Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who's also Donald Trump's pick. Yeah,
surprising in different ways. I think the endorsement from President Trump on Mike Collins is not surprising in that it happened. I think a lot of people suspected for a long time that it may happen, but the timing of it was surprising when we had already completed all of early voting. And then the real surprising one was Governor Kemp, who had consistently said, I'm staying out of the governor's race to name my successor at the very last hour to come in so heavily for Burt Jones against Rick Jackson, who had been a major donor of his. So lots of surprises.
Is it going to make the difference? As we pointed out in the intro to this, it came after early voting. Early voting in Georgia has increasingly become a really important time for candidates to hoover up as many votes as possible. These big endorsements come, they certainly get our attention, right? Yeah. But do they convince enough voters to either come out when they weren't going to come out or to flip their vote from one candidate to the other? Stephen? Fred?
Yeah. It's there's a lot of risk there. I mean, I think that was one of the surprising things is that there's some diminishing returns, right, on these endorsements potentially. First with President Trump, I mean, again, but with both, early voting was already closed. The books were done. Over half of the vote was already in. And not only do you have to, Zach, to your point, educate voters about those endorsements, but you've got to get them out in a timely manner to only half of the electorate. It's a gamble. It's a gamble for sure.
Fred?
And it's a gamble that both Brian Kemp and Donald Trump are making about Jon Ossoff. Because to me, the way I read this, and it might be a little bit of a stretch, but for me, the governor's been very clear that getting Derek Dooley elected is his top priority. And so the way I read the endorsement was that, hey, President Trump had endorsed Mike Collins, and he wanted to blunt that momentum and want to blur the lines as much as possible. So if he could get behind Burt Jones, then for the Burt Jones voters, and especially in the rural parts of the state, they might say, well, the governor's here, and so I'm going to go and stick with the governor up and down the ballot. The other part of that to me is that I think that I think that for the president, he wants to get his person over the line. And so for Brian Kemp, this is a safe bet because if Burt Jones does not win, he doesn't really take the loss on that. I mean, because he and President Trump supported Burt Jones. So there's not a lot at risk for him, but there's a lot to gain for his top candidate, Derek Dooley.
All right, guys.